Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here and a proud member. It's June 19th and you're with a virtual City Club forum live from the studios of 90.3 WCPN IdeaStream, our public media partner. We're deeply grateful to them today and every week. Today is Juneteenth, an annual holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. It has been celebrated by African Americans since the late 1800s. However, this year, following nationwide protests over police brutality and the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and others, there's renewed interest in this day that celebrates freedom. Today, we'll talk with two journalists, originally from Cleveland, now working at nationally regarded publications, about their work and the meaning of their work in this moment. Before I introduce them, I want to thank our generous members and sponsors and donors who support these virtual forums. You can see a full list of all of them at cityclub.org/thank-you. And you can join them in supporting our work when you make a contribution or become a member at cityclub.org. Now to our speakers. Erika D. Smith is a columnist, a Metro columnist for the Los Angeles Times. She writes about the diversity of people and places across California, and she joined the Times in 2018 as an assistant editor and helped expand coverage of the state's housing and homelessness crisis. She previously worked at the Sacramento Bee, where she was a columnist and editorial board member, covering housing, homelessness, and social justice issues, and for the Indianapolis Star, as well as the Akron Beacon Journal once upon a time. Jamil Smith is also with us. He's a senior writer at Rolling Stone, where he covers national affairs and culture. Throughout his career as a journalist and Emmy Award-winning television producer, he's explored the intersection of politics and identity. I want to mention, too, that our forum today began with an idea from City Club member Chanel Smith-Wiggum. Big thanks to you, Chanel. We appreciate it. I should note that all the Smiths I've just mentioned are not actually related. So you can join our City Club forum as every week. You can participate with your questions. You can text your questions to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. You can also tweet them at the City Club, and we will work them in the second half of the program. Erika Smith, Jamil Smith, welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. And we wish you were here, back in Cleveland.
Wish we were too. Thank you.
Indeed, we wish we were home.
Yeah, it is wonderful to have you both join us today. Happy Juneteenth to you. Jamil Smith, I want to start by asking both of you about Juneteenth and what it means to you as a journalist today. Jamil, you dropped a piece just this morning for Rolling Stone about it. Tell us about it.
Indeed. I wrote a piece entitled Emancipation is Not Freedom. Essentially, I view Emancipation Day, Juneteenth, as is really the most honest Independence Day that there is in this country. I think that, this day, June 19th, 1865, the day that the last enslaved people were informed that they, in fact, were liberated by the Emancipation Proclamation. As the day that America was given the chance to really honor its promise of liberty for all. And unfortunately, it didn't honor that promise. And, of course, abolition didn't come until the 13th Amendment was ratified. But, really 12 years later, 1877, we saw Rutherford B. Hayes renege on the promise of Reconstruction. And we saw, racial terrorism flood the I guess you could say the prosperity that had been, flourishing. The equality that had already been, coming about, throughout the South. I really just think that this country, teases us with the possibility of equality for Black Americans. And right now we're seeing a possible tipping point. And I think what we need to do is follow through, possibly with a new Reconstruction. And that's what I argue for in this piece.
Jamil Smith, as I said, is with Rolling Stone. Erika Smith of the Los Angeles Times, and a Solon High School graduate as well. Important to note, Jamil Smith, a graduate of both of Shaker High School and Hawken Middle School. Erika, this Juneteenth feels different from every other Juneteenth that we have experienced as a nation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, growing up, I didn't really celebrate Juneteenth like a lot of folks did, probably functioned somewhat of growing up in Solon. But as I've gotten older, it's become more and more important. And I would argue this year, it's by far the most important. And, I've done a lot of reflecting as I've like a lot of Black journalists have covered a lot of these protests over the years, whether it's Michael Brown, in my case, it was Stephon Clark in Sacramento, now obviously George Floyd. It just feels like up until now, we've been piggyback on what Jamil said, kind of like free-ish, not really free. And I feel like this is maybe a tipping point to his piece, kind of getting to what was promised so many decades ago. And it's liberating living through this time, but it's also tiring, I think. And so when I reflect on Juneteenth, that's what I think about, is that kind of that duality of emotion.
Jamil Smith, Erika just mentioned your cover story in the most recent issue of Rolling Stone. The title of the cover story is "The Power of Black Lives Matter." I'd want to ask you to talk about the piece, to talk about the origins of the piece. There's a lot of, it's almost like too obvious. Like, why would you write about this right now? I mean, it's sort of almost a silly question to ask, but I want to ask you to talk about like how you approached there's so much has been written about Black Lives Matter, and yet so much is, we forget sometimes the origins and that you go back to and spend some time reflecting on. So tell us about this piece that you just finished.
Yes, and I think, to a large degree, I think it's specific to Rolling Stone readers. I mean, a lot of folks are, coming into awareness of this movement for the first time, and I wanted to ensure that folks understood essentially the origins of it. We wanted to understand, that this movement comes from 3 Black women, 2 of whom are queer women, and we want to understand why, this movement came about, why this movement, began with such essentially really a basic demand, and why that demand is now elevated from, something that in 2013 people, didn't really want to repeat, at least, certainly corporations wanted to shy away from, to something that now people are slapping onto, every Instagram and Facebook post, and people are continuing to embrace, from a multicultural standpoint. And now it is essentially what we say in the piece is that it has lifted the floor for what is possible, and it is now, essentially made possible demands such as defunding the police, and has made it possible for us to reimagine what our society should be looking for in terms of its demands for law enforcement, in terms of its demands for public safety.
It's funny, Jamil, when you just said that we have this opportunity to reimagine what our society does, how our society works, what it stands for. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, when there was this sort of great pause on economic activity, and there were a lot of people asking that question too, but in a different way, not specifically about Black Lives Matter, but more about just generally economic justice and whether or not we could use the pause and the restart to create an economy and a society that works better for more people or works better for all. The layering on of the Black Lives Matter movement and this moment has really shifted that. And it does feel like there are possibilities today that were not available to America. They've always been available, but sort of there wasn't enough momentum behind them, enough something. Talk about that a little bit.
Yes, I think that, certainly that these times have made what you might call the holes in the boat in our America more conspicuous. I think that certainly the Trump presidency has also made those things more conspicuous. These faults in the American project have always been there. And certainly I think the more disenfranchised people, the more marginalized peoples within this country have always been loud and pointed about, making sure that people understand what they are. We've always been protesting. We've always been saying, "Hey, help us." We always said, "Hey, we've had issues in our communities. We need help. We need help from our government. We need assistance. We need people to pay attention." But unfortunately, folks, enjoy privilege. People enjoy living in bubbles, and people have been able to secure themselves in those bubbles. And the coronavirus pandemic has broken a lot of those bubbles down. And while it wasn't the sort of universal experience that I think a lot of people made it out to be, I think it, certainly while it touched everybody on the planet, it didn't touch everybody equally. It certainly revealed faults within our society at a greater level than I think perhaps ever before. And it made those things more conspicuous. And I think when the economy collapses within a week, when our faults in our healthcare system and our food supply and in various different areas of our society becomes so evident that we need to take emergency action so quickly, I think people take notice. And I think when it comes to the idea that white supremacy creates those kinds of deficiencies, then I think people need to, they think people say, hey, maybe I need to become active in fighting this thing. Maybe I need to find ways to, learn a little bit more about how I can take an active role within my own life, even if it's raising anti-racist children. So then make sure that the next generation doesn't come up this way. That is important. And I think the people, to their credit, are taking an active role in that.
Jamil Smith is a senior writer with Rolling Stone. Erika Smith is also with us from the LA Times. Erika, in this moment, there are 2 deaths in Southern California that would ordinarily raise a lot of questions, and those questions are especially poignant because of the context of this moment. Black Lives Matter, the hanging deaths of 2 Black men, one of them homeless. Not a lot of people, there hasn't been a lot of national coverage. You've covered this well, and your colleagues have covered it very well at the LA Times. But can you talk a little bit about those 2 hangings and their meaning right now?
Sure. But really quickly, I did want to add one thing to Jamil just said. I do think that the coronavirus did have the function of everybody being at home and actually being able to pay attention to what was going on. I think the fact that we were all sitting at home, most of us were sitting at home in front of our TVs, the people that actually needed to see it, the people that weren't out working because they had to, mostly the Black and brown folks in this country, they were able to actually see what was happening in real time. And I do think that had an effect on the scale of the protests that we've seen. But to answer your other question about the 2 hangings that we've had in Southern California, one in Palmdale and one in the city of Victorville, which are basically about an hour east of Los Angeles. There have been a spate of reports of hangings all over the country, about 6 now. I'm getting my numbers correct. But these 2 particular ones happened in an area where African Americans have been moving into these neighborhoods from LA, mostly because they've been priced out because of housing prices, which has caused racial tensions to spike. And this has been going on for years. This is not a new thing, but there's a lot of tension between police and the African American community in these high desert cities. And so 2 men have been found hung probably within 10 days or so of each other. And in both instances, the sheriff's departments, there's 2 of them, San Bernardino and LA County, decided to basically preemptively rule them as a suicide. Obviously that got out. The families were very upset about this idea that they were just going to take the hangings of these 2 Black men and just kind of sweep it under the rug. And so there've been protests and demands, and now the FBI is involved as well as our state attorney general's office is also investigating. But obviously, given what's going on with the protests and the tensions over race in this country, residents were understandably upset that this was just going to be not looked at as a potential homicide. So it's an ongoing investigation. The autopsy reports are still pending, but.
Erika, you visited both communities this week. What did residents tell you?
Basically that they were very skeptical of the both sheriff's departments and their initial ruling, but at the same time they saw it as a continuation of practices that have been a part of these communities for at least a decade. Both Palmdale in particular has had a long history of racial profiling for police federal investigations. There have been the HUD has had to investigate over basically sheriff's deputies raiding Section 8 housing units with military style raids. There have been a series of issues over the years that have been investigated, and paid settlements have been paid, but there's still a lot of tension. And so they're very upset about this, and understandably so. And you could argue that in California, these particular areas are probably some of the most tense as far as racial dynamics in part because it's moving people out of urban coastal areas and inland, and where the population has historically been far more conservative and far more white.
I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you both to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement with a little bit more with respect to the LGBTQ community. And Jamil, as you've written about, the two of the three founders identify as lesbian, and this moment, particularly this week with the Supreme Court decision, Erika, has kind of shifted the dynamics in our country and in our nation with respect to, at least with respect to officially, discrimination against members of the LGBTQ community. How does it, Erika, how does it feel for you as a journalist reporting on this and writing about this and being open about your own identity as a member of the LGBTQ community?
I mean, it's interesting it's always been a little bit of a weird thing being part of both. I mean, being both queer and being Black and also being a woman, you're able to have a foot in lots of different roles. And I think mainly because of the way rights have come for the LGBT community in such in some ways a rush, I guess, as civil rights go in this country over the last 10, 15 or so years, there's been inevitable comparisons with civil rights among African Americans. And I think that now, given, as Jamil has written, two of the three members of founders of Black Lives Matter are queer women, I think that those two movements are very much colliding. And what was most interesting, at least in Los Angeles, is seeing how there's been this embrace of intersectionality of identities, and how, it's of course not across the board, but there seems to be more of a willingness to kind of understand that you can't just take one group and deal with the oppression of this group, but not deal with the rest of people. Like, one person's oppression is everybody's oppression. And that, that has been a message that's been part of our history. I mean, people often forget that gay pride was started by a number of, transgender women of color in New York City as a riot. It did not start as a big parade with a lot of glitter. It started people being very upset with police officers continually arresting and harassing this particular community. And so in the vein of continuing civil rights in this country, that's what we're seeing on the streets today, I think.
But that's very different. I mean, as you pointed out in your recent column, that the Black community has not always embraced members of the LGBTQ community, and the LGBTQ community has not always embraced Black members of its own community.
No, there's racism definitely within the LGBT community, and vice versa. And so it's, I'm hoping that maybe we'll start to break down some barriers. The parade that happened, it was really more of a rally/parade sort of thing that happened, was intended to kind of bridge those gaps. And there's a long way to go. I mean, in every major city in this country, there's deep wounds that that people feel that the majority white members of the LGBT community have inflicted upon the people of color within that community. And it's going to take a while to kind of work through that stuff. But I do see a willingness to kind of share the burden of oppression. And that's nice to see.
Jamil Smith, writing as you do for Rolling Stone, which has sort of been the voice of you think about it as like the voice of counterculture long ago, and then it becomes sort of a mainstream. It is both mainstream and counterculture, I guess, at this point. But in the world in which you write, as a member of the media is not an incredibly diverse place. Talk about what it's like for you right now to be a writer of color writing for the Rolling Stone.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important role. I feel that I'm a person who is charged with ensuring that a magazine this important represents a particular moment in a particular way. And that is, I think, a particularly heavy burden. And it's not necessarily one that I should bear alone. And that's why I'm encouraging my editors, and they are willing, and they're, to, make sure that they're reaching out for diverse voices, whether it's in freelance or looking for new staff positions. And I'm thankful that I work for not just a staff and editors, but also a corporation that's always looking for more diverse voices and supporting, a Juneteenth holiday. I happen to be in an empty office right now. That's empty because everyone has off for the Juneteenth holiday. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that, during this, this coronavirus pandemic, I've seen the kind of support for, my Black colleagues, in that I've really, frankly, haven't seen in a lot of other stops, up the corporate ladder in my media career. And, frankly, Rolling Stone, despite, even they'll admit, they could do better with regards to, diversity figure. I think that, they are trying to do better. And I just think that, there's a lot of folk, a lot of places in media that just, they don't really care as much. And I think caring is the first step. They want to do better. They don't want to necessarily have Black voices just writing about quote unquote Black subjects. They want diverse voices writing about diverse topics. They want Black voices in different departments and doing different things. And, we have a Black creative director. We have, Black, social media director. We have, Black people in sales and doing different things throughout the magazine. I'm really, really encouraged by the diversity I have seen throughout the magazine, and I'm encouraged by the growth still to come.
Jamil Smith is a senior writer at Rolling Stone. Erika Smith of the LA Times is with us. Both Erika and Jamil Smith are from Greater Cleveland and now writing for these nationally regarded publications. And we're talking about the work of journalism for these two Black writers in the midst of this Black Lives Matter moment, and which doesn't really do it justice at all. And like sometimes, you're searching for the right words, and it's a lot easier if you've got an editor behind you to help. But if you'd like to join our conversation, you can text your question to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. You can tweet your question at the City Club. We'll work it in. I want to talk to you both about the protester demands that we've actually been discussing a lot here at the City Club Forum and the Friday Forum and other forums throughout the last few weeks. Demands to defund the police or abolish the police, demands to really see and and ensure that our cities and our communities become places that are simply more just. And the responses to these demands are really different in so many places. And I'd like to ask you both to kind of contextualize, to help our community here in Cleveland understand how the nation is responding. Because sometimes, in these individual communities, here we are, a few hours from Bethel, Ohio, right, where protesters were met by armed counter-protesters and assault charges have been issued, and also, where city leadership here in Cleveland, when asked about defunding the police, replied, "That's absurd. That would never happen." Erika Smith, what's the conversation like in LA with Mayor Eric Garcetti, who I should mention actually spoke at the City Club a couple of years ago?
Oh, okay. Yeah. It's been interesting. I do think the pressure that he's gotten from Black Lives Matter activists in particular has started to have really an effect. He did come out. The other interesting thing about all these protests happening now is it happened at a time when basically city and state governments were in the middle of their budget cycles in counties. And so it presented definitely an opportunity in real time to really talk about how we're going to, reframe our finances to actually meet the needs of the people. And, to Garcetti's credit, he did actually, come out and say that, yes, we're going to look at defunding the police to an extent. Now, granted, he's also coming at this, LAPD has gotten better since 92, but it's not the best department. It was only a couple of months ago that there was an LAPD officer on camera beating up some person in handcuffs in Boyle Heights. So this is not like, these excessive force claims don't still happen. And so the groundswell has definitely been the case to do that. I would say in other cities in California, the conversation's been happening. My former home of Sacramento is definitely proceeding along that path. There have been similar conversations in Oakland and San Francisco. The one thing about California that people tend to forget when they think of us as a very liberal state is that the police unions here have way more power here than almost any state in the country. And until very recently, many things that you could get as journalists, just getting basically background information on officers, their disciplinary records. Those things were off limits until basically about a year and a half ago, when the legislature finally were able to kind of tell the police unions and the money no, and actually pass these bills. So it'll be really interesting to see, I think, what's going to happen over the next year. Definitely the police unions are not getting as far as they used to with either state lawmakers or in cities. And so there seems to be a changing of the guard. And so we'll have to see how that happens. But I'm heartened to see that the conversations are actually happening.
Jamil, from a national perspective, where are you seeing these efforts to shift responsibilities? I mean, the phrase "defund the police," "abolish the police," those are they trigger some people. And really, in the end, I mean, we're talking about sort of reallocating funds to provide better services to the communities which police and others are asked to serve. Where are you seeing success? I mean, we know Minneapolis has sort of declared that they're going to completely, tear apart and rebuild public safety in their city. But what are you seeing? What are you looking at?
I'm looking at Minneapolis. Certainly he saw the mayor, Jacob Fry, booed essentially out of a protest when he refused to defund the police. But then, shortly thereafter, the city council essentially overruled him and said that they were going to look at disbanding the police. You see cities looking to, other cities like Camden, New Jersey, which essentially in the past has disbanded its entire police department and rebuilt it from the ground up. They're looking to cities like Camden as models. And I think you're going to see a lot more cities thinking about, essentially, embracing that kind of model. You're looking at cities like LA, as Erika mentioned, thinking about using social workers on calls to respond to certain particular calls, non-emergencies, in particular. From what I've been tracking, I've been looking more broadly, of course, but I think one of the things when I speak to activists, one of the things they're trying to drive at is just to get cities to think just differently, just frankly embrace different models. Abolishment is not necessarily something that's off the table, but one of the things that is key, I think, to reform efforts is qualified immunity is a term that we hear a lot, and it's something that is key to the Democratic House reform, something that Republicans have ruled completely off the table. But qualified immunity is key to the
explain what that means,
because a term that sounds a little complicated, but you're talking about something that is cops essentially get off because of different set of terms. Qualified immunity allows them to be held to a different standard, and if you are held to a different standard for a particular violent act, then if that allows them to act with a little bit more impunity than certainly the rest of us. And what we're seeing now is certainly in the Rayshard Brooks case, we're seeing DAs be a little bit more aggressive, certainly than the Timothy McGinty's of the past in Cleveland. But we're still seeing, of course, in Louisville, DAs being a little bit more cautious in the Breonna Taylor case. So what we need to see, honestly, I think it's a nationwide effort to look at qualified immunity as a reform, and then certainly overall look at the overall role of police in communities.
It's interesting that, when you talk about qualified immunity, I think about like the presumption of innocence that our courts and our justice system allegedly has. And so then with respect to police officers and qualified immunity, it's like a super presumption of innocence. Like, no, we really mean it this time.
Right. I mean, it's a qualified immunity essentially gives police not just the benefit of the doubt, but it's telling them that essentially we believe you before we believe that you're innocent. We're basically giving you not just the benefit of the doubt, but we're saying that, like, look, you're innocent, and the person who's accusing you, I don't know. It's just it's just giving so much weight to the police in a court, in any kind of adjudication, that I think anybody who's trying to bring a case against the police just really has very, very little hope. And I think if you have any kind of sense of any kind of justice or any kind of hope for justice, we really just cannot operate like this in a society, considering the kind of record of abuse that we're seeing. I mean, I know records of abuse and violence are down, but the disproportionate effect, we're seeing 4 times the number of killings are still affecting African Americans as opposed to white people.
As you say that, I'm reminded, Erika Smith, of a definition of white supremacy that a friend shared with me several years ago, kind of prior to the phrase being in part of our mainstream dialogue and national dialogue. That white supremacy isn't just about white supremacist organizations, but she said it's a system. It is the ways in which all of our systems bend toward the credibility of whiteness. Mm-hmm. Qualified immunity would seem to me to be a really textbook example of that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as Jamil said, I mean, it's just giving basically the benefit of the doubt and then some to a system that it's working well. And I think that to me is the ultimate, kicker, right? I mean, we're basically saying, even though we have, decades and decades and decades of data showing that the criminal justice system does not work equally, we basically have policies that are built on this very idea that they work equally. And therefore, we're going to give people who are a part of the system, who are working for the system, the benefit of the doubt. And so, I mean, at some point, there has to be some sort of reckoning of the two. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. And I think it took, like many things, maybe it just took this particular case for the rest of the country. Maybe it took COVID and everybody being in the house to kind of see that and to wake up. But I think there's definitely a lot of pressure. And it was actually very disappointing on the same day that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of upholding, workplace discrimination laws for the LGBTQ community. The same day as that, they also declined to hear several cases involving that would potentially challenge qualified immunity. And so, this handing out of civil rights and how civil rights is handled in this country is still very, very uneven. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to remember that. And it is great to see DAs actually finally starting to charge some of these officers. And there's definitely been a hesitancy to do so. It'll be interesting to see come November if a number of DAs who are up for re-election, including here in Los Angeles, if the progressive candidate wins, or if it ends up being some of the tough on crime folks that have been in power for so long. So,
Erika Smith is a Metro columnist for the Los Angeles Times. Jamil Smith, senior writer for Rolling Stone. They are our Friday Forum speakers here at the City Club of Cleveland here on Juneteenth. And we're going to turn now to questions from our audience. You can join with your question when you text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794, or you tweet it at the City Club, and we'll work it into the program. This question from actually a former board member of the City Club: how do you respond to your white colleagues and friends when they ask what they can do to address racism in America? This is a Black woman, by the way.
Okay. Jamil, do you want to take that one first, or did you?
Sure. Well, thank you both. But there's this question, right?
How I respond, how I respond is I ask them first, what are they already doing? What are you already doing? And so, if I hear that they're already volunteering or they're doing nothing, or they just at a loss, then, when I told an old colleague the other night, I asked him first, how many kids do you have? And he told me, he said 13, 10, and 8-year-old. And I said, first, raise your kids to be anti-racist. That's the first and best thing that you can do. Second of all, do your best to be intellectually curious and be a critical thinker. And so I said, because he and I were tight, I didn't mind him asking me, but I told him, I said, Black people are tired right now. Black folks are, not wanting to be, looked at as sort of libraries of information. They don't want to be the person that stopped on the street being like, please help me, please guide me towards the light. Folks just want to be living their lives, and folks are traumatized right now. Folks can go to Google. Folks, there's a lot of resources out here that you can access. There's a lot of folks, there's a lot of lists, there's a lot of listicles and bestseller lists that you can access right now. Schomburg Center, there's all kinds of websites and resources for you that you can access. Trust me, we live in the information age. I implore you, please be curious, please ask. There's even white-led organizations that are doing good work. I think that I really do trust people to find information for themselves and not, I think, lean so heavily upon their Black colleagues and friends who are going through a rough time right now, to provide all of the guidance that they may be seeking.
Yeah.
Erika Smith, you wrote a column about this recently, about Cash App.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, this started, Jamil knows this, but, when you're a journalist, you get a lot of weird emails from people and just messages on multiple different platforms. And so I was getting these messages, not long after, George Floyd, the video surfaced, and people just asking me how I'm doing and, what can they do to help? And it was very strange because it was not people that I knew very well. It was people that I hadn't talked to probably in 20 years. And, I started asking around and to some of my friends who are Black, and they were like, yeah, that happened to me too. And it was shocking that it was like a thing. So I wrote about it. But, to Jamil's point, I think that Black people are kind of done being people's Sherpas. Like, we don't really want to Google stuff for you. It's just, you can do it just like we can. But I think, that column, it was interesting because it prompted a number of responses, including from close friends who feared that they were the ones that were, burdening themselves, and I had to tell them no. But for people, I even told them, it's like, I think the thing that white people can do the most, and I would tell anybody this, is, do the things that African Americans can't. I mean, white people have a lot more, ability to navigate the networks of power than we do in often cases. There's a lot of things that happen that are outside of the eye of African Americans, where we don't have spheres of influence. And if you can, get your lobbyist friends to lean on these lawmakers to be more willing to pass laws that affect African Americans and help us towards justice, then do that. Or if you can lean on those lawmakers, or get your wealthy suburban friends to write letters and push lawmakers to do something else. I mean, I think it's like, do the things that African Americans aren't in a position to do. I think that's where you start to look. I mean, beyond the general, like, Googling the books to read and stuff. I think the days of just writing a check and thinking that, or sending somebody money via Cash App, is kind of over. I guess that's helpful for some people, but that's not enough to say that you've helped towards justice. You have to do more than that. And that's kind of, I think, where a lot of people are right now.
Well, it's worth pointing out that one of the top 2 or 3 books selling in America right now is literally titled How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, which pretty much spells it out right there. You mentioned sort of critical thinking, Jamil, and it occurs to me, and one of the things that I've noticed over these last few weeks, and actually last few years, to be perfectly frank, but like that a piece of this is not just being a critical thinker, but being really self-critical. That it's imperative for white people to really critique themselves and be open to the critique that they receive from others about ways in which they may be operating within and supporting, inadvertently, perhaps, a racist structure.
Yeah, and I want to go back a little bit in this question to, we were talking about Black journalists and Black media, and I think people really need to critique their media diet in this regard. I think people we consume on a daily basis, sometimes uncritically, a lot of media that is harmful to us, and we consume just uncritically a lot of sources that we are just simply used to. because we simply, quote unquote, trust them. And why do we trust them? Well, we trust them because, well, they look like us, or they sound like us, or they sound like people, that we are related to, or we know. That we have to rethink a lot as Americans, specifically talking to white Americans here, rethink why you trust the sources that you trust. And, we seek out new sources of news, seek out new sources of opinion, seek out, Black journalists who are writing. And you're not always going to be able to tell by the byline who is Black and who is white. You have to do some investigation. You're not necessarily going to know that Wesley Lowery is Black or white, but he is Black and he's actually from Shaker Heights.
He's spoken at the City Club as well.
Exactly. You're going to have you have to investigate, to find out, whether or not an Ested Herndon or an Aaron Haynes. All these different writers, Sarita McFadden, all these different writers and television folks, are out there. You just have to go find them. It takes time. It takes energy. It takes intellectual curiosity. And this is something that you have to invest your time and your effort in. And it's going to make your media experience richer. It's going to make your knowledge richer. And frankly, if this is something that you want to get to know more about, then, frankly, this is what you have to do.
There's another question from a listener who's wondering what comes to mind when about your upbringing. Was there anything about your upbringing in Northeast Ohio, both of you, that has impacted your understanding of race and racism? Erika, can you start?
Well, growing up in Solon, I grew up in Solon in the late 80s, early 90s. I graduated in 95. And so, the thing I always tell people about Solon is at the time when I went there, it was probably the racial population of the US at that time. And so the one thing is it very much prepared me for, as much as I went kicking and screaming to Solon from Warrensville, from my parents, I was eternally grateful later graduating, one, because there was a newspaper there that I could work. So I understood how to write journalistically, but also just understanding how to work with people of different races. I think that that's something that in the workplace, and I can trace back to that time. And I remember specifically a time in Solon when there was some real angst about the number of African-American students there, that people were feeling that they weren't being represented and teachers were talking down to them. And there was this little mini revolt in Solon, which was really strange. But I got to write about it actually in that paper, which I found later, like in my 20s, that I wrote, which would arguably probably be my first column. But it was writing kind of really about racial justice then within the Solon School District. And so in some ways, I think that very much that whole experience and being a minority in that district and having to find a way to stand up for myself and to make sure that there was justice and to make sure that I wasn't being a victim of racism and to trying to tear down these systems, which I tried to do as much as a high school student can do. But I think that very much prepared me for what has been my adult life. So that would be my thought.
Jamil?
Yeah, certainly growing up in Shaker Heights was a formative experience. I also, grew up partially in Cleveland. And so, with parents in both cities. And I certainly think I would not be where I am today without having, spent my elementary and middle school years at Hawken. And certainly my, the encouragement that I got there from teachers like Deborah Handy in my 8th grade class, and whose first teacher who encouraged me along the lines of my writing, was invaluable. And so, moving on to Shaker Heights High School, and Sally Schwartz, trained me in terms of my journalistic writing. I certainly think that my years at Shaker Heights, working with my classmates there, was incredible. I think that it's important that students start early. If they have any kind of passions they have, it's important that they be able to start early, to train, some kind of specificity like that, to have some kind of outlet like a school paper or what have you, to be able to train and actually report on stories that are serious. I mean, my first story that I reported on was about a banner over Lee Road. I said apartheid shaker, protesting the barriers between Shaker and Cleveland, the traffic barriers. I mean, you want to talk about a story fraught with race and in class and all these different things. Talk about things that sparked my interest in what I'm doing right now. It was right there for me and where I grew up. And so I think that, all these kinds of things, they're right there if you're paying attention. And I just think that I think that if a student can be curious and a student can be encouraged along the right lines, it's all right here for you in Cleveland. And it was an amazing place to grow up, and I wouldn't have traded it for the world.
It's interesting that the question about like how your upbringing exposed you to race and racism turned into an advertisement for scholastic journalism, which is great. Like that's wonderful. As a former high school newspaper editor myself, I think that's fantastic. Those barriers that you spoke of, Jamil, have been raised as an issue again these last couple of weeks, and rightly so, and they still stand. And it's still a question for leadership in Shaker Heights about what they're going to do with those. Jamil, this is a question about anti-Semitism within the Black Lives Matter movement, which there have been these charges of anti-Semitism at various points over the last few years as different parts of the Black Lives Matter movement have been accused of such. Your piece did not touch on that at all, but what have you, and that, in some ways that feels as if it's a piece of some of the growing pains of the Black Lives Matter movement. But how do you see those charges today?
Well, I see them as is things that the individuals who said those particular words and dealt with those particular issues need to answer for. And I think that it's unfortunate, certainly, and I certainly would renounce any associations with any of those remarks. I think that folks that engage in those kinds of beliefs and those kinds of I think that's all that kind of stuff is a distraction from the ultimate goal of full liberty for our people. And I think that I don't really understand exactly why people would engage in that kind of rhetoric. To be perfectly honest, I never really have.
I want to ask you both about there's a few questions about the crisis in journalism today, which is sort of focused on local daily newspapers in many ways, but there's kind of two crises, right? There's a crisis of credibility with the label fake news, and then there's also a real crisis in terms of the business models. Erika Smith, how do you see it, and what do you see as your role in kind of contributing to the future of journalism?
Well, take the second part of your question first, to the credibility part. I think, at the Los Angeles Times, we've been having, like many papers, conversations about our staffing levels of people of color, particularly African Americans, our audience, which is an ongoing question in this age. And LA, like the state of California, is a majority minority state, and so our audience, everybody tends to agree, is going to have to grow, and it's not going to grow by getting more readers, white middle class or middle age readers. It's going to come from younger and more diverse groups of people. And so our coverage has to change, which goes to credibility. And so part of credibility is hiring people of color to continue to write and give story ideas and to make the newsroom more inclusive. And I think that is going to enhance credibility, which, if credibility is enhanced, that starts to combat some of the labels of fake news and things that are kind of circulating right now. I think that, Trump in his rhetoric has done a tremendous amount of damage, not only to news organizations as institutions, but as to institutions in general and people's trust in them. Not to say that that trust was like rock solid before, but by any means it was not. But he took those cracks and made them into basically canyons. And so there's a lot of work that our industry has to do to kind of rebuild that credibility. And a lot of this stuff we can't even blame Trump for. This is stuff we did to ourselves through years of cutting, through years of how we cut, through years of not listening to journalists of color in the newsroom about how you cover these communities, to just flat out just racist type of coverage. I mean, the LA Times has gone through a reckoning about our 1992 coverage of Rodney King and how that happened and how that has translated into how we have covered the George Floyd protests. So this kind of stuff is like, these conversations are happening in our newsrooms. I think they're ultimately healthy. I would like to think that of the papers that have the money and can survive, and I'd like to think the Times can, we're owned by a billionaire, that we can continue to invest in our newsrooms and to make journalism more democratic and increase our credibility.
Jamil?
Yes, I want to agree with what Erika said. I think the newsroom diversity is key to reestablishing the credibility of media in general, but particularly the press. I think that, one of the big faults and one of the reasons why the press was particularly weakened in this moment of attack from the president and the right is because they, were able to sustain, I guess, the level of credibility because they were too myopic with a lot of their coverage. They did not have the ability, they did not have the scope, I guess you could say, to cover a lot of the stories that were important, and they missed a lot of things that were significant that were happening in the world because, frankly, they did not have not just simply racial diversity, but also gender diversity and geographic diversity. Let's be frank about it. I mean, a lot of these newsrooms did not have. I mean, you go in these newsrooms, and they don't. Some of these folks don't know that Ohio borders Pennsylvania. I mean, it's kind of pathetic. And so it's and I spent a lot of time in New York City, and I just frankly, this notion of East Coast bias and is fortunately a reality. And I really do hope that people awaken to this idea that, I don't use the term fake news because I do think it's a tool of, propaganda. But I think that, if we don't get used to the idea that this kind of stuff is going to continue, even if Trump is, not reelected, the right sees this opportunity to promote a distrust in journalism as a tool to advance their political interests. So unless we get wise, our industry is going to suffer financially and otherwise. And we're going to see jobs lost in our industry because of their political advancement. They don't care whether or not people lose jobs. We've seen them openly celebrate people getting laid off in our business. So, we have to get wise and understand that it's either us or them, more or less.
Final question for both of you. What's next? What are the stories you're going to be tracking this summer? Erika?
Well, I think for me, I'm a relatively new columnist at the Times, and I'm really interested to see how the state of California stands, what we do with this moment that's been brought about because of COVID and because of the protests. I mean, most people know California is, ruled by Democrats in a supermajority in the state house and through so many of our city councils and counties. And so there's been a lot of rhetoric and a lot of talk and a lot of promises. I want to see how these promises come through, both in terms of law enforcement and police brutality, but also in the inequities, everyday inequities that affect so many people in this state. I mean, we are a state that has incredible wealth and incredible poverty. And you see it in our housing crisis, you see it in homelessness, you see it in healthcare, you see it in pretty much everything. And so there's a tall order of things that have to be done. And I'm hoping to cover the state and then talk about that and talk to the people and see, make sure that our lawmakers are actually doing what they say they're going to do. And
briefly, Jamil?
Yes, I'm hoping to see how we end up electing a president. amidst the coronavirus pandemic. I think that it's incredibly important to see how things will change, and I want to see how specifically Black turnout is affected, and how our networks within our communities, end up helping to produce the vote.
Well, as predicted, we did not touch on everything that we could have or hoped to. Jamil Smith is with Rolling Stone, Erika Smith with the LA Times, both from Cleveland. So good to see you both. Thank you so much. And we do promise to actually fly you to Cleveland when it's safe to fly and bring people back together again.
Great. Look forward to it.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you both, and happy Juneteenth. Our forum today is part of our Authors in Conversation series, which is sponsored by the John P. Murphy Foundation and supported in part by the residents of Cuyahoga County through a public grant from Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. We appreciate their support of City Club programs. Also, we appreciate the sponsorship of our virtual forums from the Cleveland Foundation, the George Gunn Foundation, KeyBank Nordson, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, and PNC. We're going to continue to present our virtual forums throughout this time, either online or here from the IdeaStream studios. If you have ideas, please get in touch. We're at cityclub.org. I'm Dan Moulthrop. Stay strong, stay healthy, and stay close in your hearts if you can't be close in person. Our forum is now adjourned.